So, welcome to our final alumni speaker program of this academic year. I'm pleased to have Dr. Abby Caselli, class of 2017, here to talk with us. Abby is currently an instructor of psychology at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma, soon to be a brand new assistant professor at the same institution. We're thrilled to have Abby back to tell us about her research and her path so far and what she's up to next. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Abby.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for having me. I'm super excited to be virtually back at Eastern. So today I'll talk to you about some of my research that I just recently finished up at Syracuse University. But first, I wanted to take a minute and just talk about my trajectory from my Eastern experience and thinking back of how I got here. And I think really what switched me to psychology, because I did not start Eastern as a psychology major, was probably Dr. SP's personality psychology class. So I think I attribute a lot of my trajectory to her. So thank you again. And then from there, I think just some interests in my research interests come from Dr. Scotto's human sexuality class, and then the ability to be a teaching assistant and research assistant at the university. So I think these photos are from Coplac in Tennessee, I think in 2017. So from there, I went to get my master's and doctorate at Syracuse University. And then from there, I worked with Dr. Laura Misha and as a social psychologist. And now I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma. And I know what you're probably thinking, do I own more than one dress shirt from these photos over the span of 7 years? I do own more than one. So my research interests, as I mentioned, I'm a social psychologist by training, but my research really focuses on studying people's romantic relationships. So broadly, I have two areas of research. The first, I look at ways to mitigate the negative effects of discrimination to preserve people's relationship quality. And then that will be the majority of my talk today. But I also have a second interest where I'm interested in looking at people's sense of self and how it can change throughout an individual's relationship. So everyone has a way in which they think about themselves and who they are. This is an individual's self-concept. And romantic relationships can really impact people's self-concepts in both positive and negative manners. So my second interest really focuses on ways to promote healthy relationships through an individual's sense of self. And to start with some of the literature for the research I'll be talking about today, I just wanted to orient you to some of the terms. So an interracial relationship is a relationship in which two partners do not identify as the same race. So in the context of the studies I'll be talking about today, our dyads included a white partner, and then the other partner was either Black or Hispanic. And interracial relationships are becoming more common in the United States. About 1 in 6 couples are actually interracial now. And although interracial relationships allow for people's fundamental human needs of closeness to be met, they come with additional challenges that same-race relationships might not face. One such challenge that interracial couples experience is racial discrimination. So many relationship compositions are targets of societal discrimination, such as same-gender relationships and age gap relationships. However, interracial relationships are unique in the sense that partners have differing levels of experience with racial discrimination in cases in which there's a white partner in the dyad. So to highlight this, I have a quote from Kim Kardashian. And usually Kim Kardashian probably won't be a great research example, but for right now it is. So Kim states, "To be honest, before I had my daughter North, I never really gave racism or discrimination a lot of thought. It's obviously a topic that my ex-husband Kanye is passionate about, but I guess it was easier for me to believe it was someone else's battle. But recently I read and personally experienced some incidences that have sickened me and made me take notice. I realized that racism and discrimination are still alive and just as hateful and deadly as ever." So as the quote depicts, Kim's experience was a lot different from Kanye's experience with discrimination. So interracial couples have this unique level of experience with racial discrimination. And I should note, racial discrimination is undoubtedly worse for the minority partner. However, the white partner can use it as a means to end the relationship. And in order for the white partner to stop their experience of racial discrimination, they can end their relationship. And this, unfortunately, is supported by the data that we see. That is a lot of interracial dyads in which one partner is white experience higher divorce and just general breakup rates. But not all interracial relationships end. In fact, there's some research to suggest that some couples report better quality relationships after experiencing discrimination together. So it is possible that for some, experiencing discrimination might provide an opportunity to learn more about your partner's worldview and see the world through their eyes in a really profound way. So if there were relationship researchers in the room, you might have caught on that I just described what's called self-expansion. So this process of seeing the world through a partner's perspective refers to the process of self-expansion. And self-expansion is a fundamental human motive in which people strive to expand their sense of selves to take on more perspectives, experiences, and worldviews. So people have several avenues that they can self-expand, but perhaps the most potent is through an individual's relationship. So within the context of romantic relationships, there are several ways people can self-expand. The first is probably the most well-known process proposed by Aaron and colleagues, and it suggests that people can engage in new and challenging activities together with their romantic partner as a means to self-expand. So this isn't necessarily the focus of my work today, but it helps to conceptualize how broad of a topic self-expansion is. Self-expansion can also occur when partners start to see each other's traits as their own. So that is, over the course of a relationship, partners' sense of selves begin to merge. And then through this process of self-expansion, partners begin to view each other's positive characteristics as part of their own self-concept. And then finally, partners are able to self-expand by gaining new perspectives from their partner. So gaining new perspectives, such as learning about your partner's experiences or worldview, is a particularly relevant means of self-expansion in this current research. It suggests one way in which discrimination can lead to self-expansion. Perhaps it helps the white partners learn more about the world and provide the shared experience. So in Kim's case, she can self-expand by learning about Kanye's perspective and worldview. However, this latter mechanism suggests other ways in which partners can thwart their experience of self-expansion. So it suggests that some people might begin to think of their partner's traits as their own, including their partner's stigmatized identities. So they may engage in a parallel process to self-expansion called self-adulteration. So self-adulteration is not a motive, but it is a common consequence of incorporating your partner's sense of self into your own. So that is, people not only see the positive characteristics from their partner, but also the negative ones. So by incorporating negative aspects of one's partner into your self-concept, people experience self-adulteration. So potentially there's a process that can facilitate greater self-expansion as opposed to self-adulteration. And one possible process that I was interested in is perspective taking. So perspective taking is a process in which a person considers placing themselves in another person's shoes, so seeing the world from their perspective. As I just described, whether a white partner considers their partner's perspective while experiencing racial discrimination is important for whether or not they expand their sense of self in a positive manner or perceive greater negative additions to their sense of self. It's important to note, though, that perspective taking requires a lot of cognitive resources. Therefore, when people are cognitively depleted, lack motivation or time, they might not engage in perspective taking. Yet, it's certainly worth the effort as it's associated with a host of social benefits. So for example, people who engage in perspective taking tend to be more altruistic, empathetic, and report greater social bonds for the person they took the perspective of. Additionally, in terms of outgroup relationships, perspective taking has been shown to reduce outgroup biases as well as to increase closeness among outgroup members. So importantly, for understanding how perspective taking facilitates positive interracial relationship outcomes, I argue that engaging in perspective taking may create an opportunity for the white partner to better understand the worldview and experience of their partner when facing discrimination. So to put this in a conceptual model, I predicted that when white partners take the perspective of their partner during discrimination, they not only consider their worldview, but they also build that social connection and empathy with their partner. So thus, a white partner who takes their partner's perspective after experiencing discrimination will have grown to understand that perspective that they might not have considered before. So thus they self-expand. Whereas a white partner who fails to take their partner's perspective and really focuses on these negative attributes may self-adulterate. And in turn, this greater sense of self-expansion should preserve the relationship quality, meaning these individuals will remain committed, satisfied, and close with one another. So to test this, I conducted 4 studies. The first is a correlational study. I won't talk too much about this today, but I have some supplemental slides if you're interested. And then I conducted 3 experiments. The first, when I manipulated discrimination. The second manipulates perspective taking. And then the third experiment manipulates both discrimination and perspective taking. So participants in these studies were collected from Amazon's Mechanical Turks, so an online survey platform. And they were eligible in the studies that I'll be talking about today if they identified as white and had a Black or Hispanic partner. And they had to be in this relationship for at least 6 months and live in the United States. So to assess self-expansion, I used Mattingly and colleagues' relational self-change scale, and it has 2 subscales, one for self-expansion and one for self-adulteration. And because these 2 processes are co-occurrent, I created a different score, which I call positive self-expansion. So higher scores of self-expansion, or positive self-expansion rather, indicate greater self-expansion relative to self-adulteration. And then in some studies, perspective taking was assessed using a single item. Right now, how much do you think you try to take your partner's perspective on things? And then relationship quality was assessed using 3 measures. So commitment and satisfaction were used or measured through Rustbolt's investment model. And then the closeness measure was measured using Aaron and colleagues' inclusion of the other and the self. So it's these Venn diagrams. And as the Venn diagrams overlap more, it indicates the couple has a high degree of closeness, as opposed to 2 circles that don't overlap. So in the first experiment, or study 2, I wanted to test this indirect association between discrimination and relationship quality through positive self-expansion, and I predicted it would be moderated by perspective taking. So I chose to manipulate discrimination salience. And participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions. In the first condition, they were asked to think about a time they were discriminated against because of their interracial relationship and to write about this for 5 minutes. In the second condition, they were asked to think about a time in which their car broke down where their partner was present and to also write about this for 5 minutes. In both conditions, we said, if you haven't had this experience, imagine what it would be like. And in both cases, it was very common to experience both discrimination and their car breaking down. So just to highlight some of the responses here, often couples wrote about really poor treatment in restaurant scenarios, so not being seated or receiving cold food. We did flag and remove people who wrote about something other than discrimination. For people who wrote about their car breaking down, most people gave me a just string of swear words followed by, I have no idea how I'm going to fix my car. I'm just going to call AAA. So we did, and then some individuals, though, did have a car breakdown scenario that involved discrimination. So we did opt to remove those, but if we left them, the results actually remain the same. So to test this moderated mediation model, just to orient you to the figure. So the A path looks at the effects of discrimination on positive self-expansion. So here, people in the discrimination condition perceived less positive self-expansion. So they're experiencing more self-adulteration. Right? So they're perceiving they're taking on these negative attributes from their partner. Path A2 looks at the effects of perspective taking on positive self-expansion. So the more you perceive you can take your partner's perspective, the greater perceptions of positive self-expansion you have. But really the path that I was most interested in was this interaction between perspective taking and discrimination. And to show you what that looks like, I have this graph. So on the x-axis, we have perspective taking. So higher scores mean a greater perspective taking. And then we have on the y-axis, positive self-expansion. So higher scores indicate greater positive self-expansion or taking on more positive traits compared to negative traits. And then the solid black line here represents discrimination. So for people in the discrimination condition who took their partner's perspective, they reported greater positive self-expansion compared to those in the control in the car breakdown condition, which is what we expected to find. And in return, that greater positive self-expansion predicted individuals being more committed, satisfied, and close to their partner. So then I wanted to test this further by manipulating perspective taking. So I predicted that perspective taking would be associated with relationship quality indirectly through its association with positive self-expansion. And in turn, that positive self-expansion would predict better relationship quality. So in this study, participants were asked to imagine they went to the mall with their partner. While in the store, they realized the manager of the store kept watching them. The manager was clearly watching their partner because of their race. So in this scenario, their partner is being racially profiled at the mall. And we asked them to write about this scenario from their partner's perspective. So thinking about how their partner would think and feel. And then in the control condition, we asked them to just write about the actual behaviors that are happening and to remain objective. And in this scenario, what we find when individuals took their partner's perspective during this made-up scenario of discrimination, they reported greater positive self-expansion, which in turn predicted greater commitment, satisfaction, and closeness. So again, finding support that perspective taking may be useful when experiencing discrimination. And then finally, I returned to the full model to manipulate both discrimination and perspective taking. So the discrimination salience manipulation is from the second study. So they were randomly assigned to write about discrimination or their car breaking down. But then they were asked to do this either from their partner's perspective or by remaining objective, which is the control. So again, the interaction is the path that was of most interest to our hypothesis. So here, when we look at the discrimination, we see that the solid black line is for perspective taking condition, and then the gray line, the gray box is for the perspective taking control. So people who took their partner's perspective while writing about discrimination reported greater positive self-expansion compared to those in the control condition. So again, I found support for the hypothesis. And then in turn, that higher self-expansion predicted better relationship quality again. So overall, we found support across these studies for this model. And again, importantly, showing some processes that can mitigate the negative effects of discrimination to preserve relationship quality. So I was excited to get, these results that support the hypothesis, and I started to think what else could be done with a similar model. So a lot of work has looked at perspective taking and the impact of stress, but it hasn't examined stress in terms of stress stemming from discrimination. So I was interested in potentially adding stress into this model and seeing if perspective taking can buffer that as well. So previous research has found that perspective taking is successful in reducing stress. So particularly when you're asked to imagine another person's perspective, it creates stress as a challenge rather than a threat, and it reduces some of the physiological experience of stress. Within the context of relationships, perspective taking is an important process for marital adjustment. And in turn, perspective taking has also been shown to improve relationship quality when recalling a stressful event, but this was with same-race couples. So it remained untested whether or not perspective taking can mitigate stress as it relates to an experience of discrimination for interracial couples. So we decided to test this. I used the same experiment as study 4. So we manipulated discrimination and perspective taking. And in this study, again, we had white participants from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and they were randomly assigned to one of these 4 conditions. And after writing about the prompt, we asked them to report how much momentary stress that they're experiencing on a scale from 0 to 100. So here, the orange box is perspective taking, the gray box is that control, so remaining objective. And what we see is for individuals who wrote about an experience of discrimination from their partner's perspective, they reported lower momentary related stress. And in turn, they then reported being more committed and satisfied to their relationship. So at this point, I was really interested in this perspective taking piece to see what else it could do, and particularly thinking about the case of non-romantic partners. So I conducted the study at Syracuse where we had Syracuse University students, so undergraduates, come into the lab, and they were told, "We're interested in how people form relationships by texting." And they believed they were about to text another Syracuse student, but in reality, it was a Confederate, which was just pre-programmed responses. So we start off by saying, like, "Thank you for coming in. You're going to text another student, but we were wondering if we could take your picture to upload to our platform so you have a profile picture, because your texting partner agreed to do it, so we want to see if you'll give us a photo." So most agreed. We take their photo just to heighten the believability of this. And then while the research assistant says, "Okay, I'm going to upload your photo, but can you just take this brief questionnaire?" And they take a questionnaire asking where they live, if they're on campus or off campus, their year in school, and then their gender identity. And the survey was used to match the Confederate. So then the program goes on and says, "Wait a minute, we're getting your partner's profile to try to increase the believability." And then, so the female students were matched with Olivia, male students were matched with Noah. Both were matched for the year in school, whether or not they live on and off campus. And then we say, "Okay, you're going to text each other for about 20 minutes. We'll give you the texting prompts." And the texting prompts were from Aaron and colleagues' Fast Friends paradigm. So there are a series of high self-disclosing questions that are shown to create feelings of closeness among strangers. So we're trying to elicit feelings of almost friendship among these strangers. So for example, would you like to be famous? In what way? Why? And then what would happen is the participant would type in their response, and then they would see their texting partner's response, so the confederate. Sometimes they would see your partner's still texting just a minute to try to heighten this idea that they are texting another person, not just a computer. So they did this for about 20 minutes, and then we gave them another question. We asked them if they could write about a time they experienced poor treatment somewhere. And both of the Confederates talked about a time where they experienced a case of discrimination within the context of a restaurant. So they went to the restaurant, they were seated last, other people were getting seated before them, their food was cold, and the waitress was rude to them. So then we tell the participants, you're done texting your partner. We're interested if learning more about how you perceived your partner's experience of poor treatment. So we asked them to recall their partner's experience of being treated poorly, either from their partner's perspective or from the control, which is just remaining objective. So we are interested again in whether or not, in this case, non-romantic partners, if perspective taking during recalling experiences of racial discrimination can elicit feelings of closeness. So after they write about this experience, we then give them a measure of closeness. So relative to your relationship with both same and opposite sex, how do you characterize your relationship with your assigned partner from the study? So again, what we expected to find is greater perspective taking should create higher feelings of closeness. And that's what we did find. So here the orange is the perspective taking condition, the gray is the control condition. And you can see that those in the perspective taking condition perceive greater closeness through their interactions with their texting partner. If you were following the news in 2019 when we conducted this study, you might remember that Syracuse experienced a series of hate crimes on campus. So this was about 2 weeks. The events were really salient among the student population, nationally as well. So when we were collecting this data, the hate crimes happened right in the middle of data collection. So before analyzing the really clean-cut manuscript that I had prepared, we decided to look at whether or not time influenced this process. And what we find is when comparing the participants who took this study before and during the hate crimes, the experience of hate crimes wiped out the effect. So perspective taking was no longer as beneficial as it had been prior to the hate crimes. So in short, whereas taking someone else's perspective is a proven method to generate closeness in interracial pairs, it was doing just that with our college sample. But when that unanticipated quasi-experiment occurred, the salience of racism really undermined its effectiveness. So the literature has pointed out some individual factors that influence perspective taking, like an individual's sense of power and self-esteem. Now we have some initial evidence that suggests situational factors, like in this case, the racial context surrounding the interaction may matter too. So these are important to study more systematically. We just finished data collection last semester where we replicated using a 2x2. So we had racial salience where they either read the New York Times article about the hate crimes on campus, or they read an article about COVID on campus. And then they were asked to either think about this from their texting partner's perspective or to remain objective. I don't have the data analyzed yet, but stay tuned on that one. And then the last study I wanted to talk to you about today was a final extension of my work. So in the last two versions of my work, I focused on this perspective taking piece, and I wanted to go back to this piece on interracial relationships because I am a relationship researcher and looking at ways to preserve relationship quality. So previously my work focused on challenges stemming from outside the relationship, such as racial discrimination and stress. But this extension of my work focuses on ways in which we can combat stressors from within the relationship. One such stressor that I was interested in was cultural conflict. So although it's multi-caused, ineffectively navigating cultural differences in a relationship can severely impact someone's relationship quality. So cultural differences create opportunities for greater conflict to arise in interracial relationships, which can potentially lead to dissolution and breakup. So, for example, there's research within the clinical literature that suggests couples going to therapy believe that their problems are stemming from what they call generic relationship concerns. In actuality, through working with therapists, it's been shown that these conflicts are actually arising from cultural differences. And then, in fact, most interracial couples experience conflict in their relationship due to these cultural differences. But as we saw before with discrimination, some couples do report better relationship quality after having these conflicts. So one possible process that may explain why some couples thrive due to this added conflict might be how they respond to their partner's destructive behavior. So partners can just respond constructively or destructively to the conflict at hand. One process, known as accommodation, is an interdependent process that's associated with a lot of benefits for relationships, such as people being more satisfied and committed. In particular, constructive accommodation is when partners actively seek to improve their relationship or passively and optimistically wait for the relationship to improve. So I was interested in potentially the extent to which couples engage in constructive accommodation can have an impact on the overall relationship quality. So to test this in one study, on the x-axis here, higher scores indicate greater conflict. On the y-axis is commitment, so higher scores indicate people who are more committed to the relationship. And here, the gray line is people who engage in greater constructive accommodation. And what we find is, in terms of heightened conflict, those who engaged in constructive accommodation reported higher amounts of commitment. So it's been shown to buffer some of that negative consequences of of conflict in the relationship. So through funding through the Love Consortium, I'm testing this process over time currently. So looking at the extent to which couples perceive constructive accommodation, if that can impact their commitment levels over time. So just to summarize, so most of my work so far focuses on one member of the dyad. Future work, I hope to look at both members. So for example, not just how Kim influences Kanye, but how that influence could then go back and influence Kim. And some of this research has been looked at in same race couples. So for example, husbands and wives perspective taking is usually associated with one another. So if Kim doesn't take Kanye's perspective, it's unlikely that Kanye will take Kim's perspective. And then it's also been shown that perspective taking dyadically has an influence on the relationship as well. So if Kanye takes Kim's perspective, that may be associated with Kim's level of satisfaction in the relationship, and vice versa. So overall, I'm interested in further looking at the dyad rather than just the individual couple member. So overall, I'm looking at ways to mitigate the negative effects of relationship quality, the negative effects of discrimination on relationship quality for those in relationships that face discrimination. So looking at those internal and external stressors. Well, thank you all again.
Thank you, Abby, for sharing your research and a little bit about your path to where you are today. It was really interesting, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and stop recording, and then we can have some questions and conversation.